Hello there. The following video is the first in a series of 4 videos that will make up a complete review and analysis of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. My original intent was to make one large video encompassing the whole game, but as the script started to reach astronomical numbers, that option became less and less viable. Not only because of my lack of experience, but also since this is the first big project I'm making for this channel. My first blind playthrough of this game took about 83 hours, and the main story cutscenes alone take just under 10.5 hours. This is a massive game, and I intend to discuss all, if not most of it. This first video will primarily be about the level design, combat system, and other gameplay elements. The next 2 videos will split the discussion about the story in half, and the last video will be about the future-connected quasi-DLC extra story. There will be spoilers throughout all 3 of these videos, so if you haven't played this game, here's what I would say. It starts off with the best opening I've ever played in a JRPG. Everything about the story and gameplay is set up in a tight but powerful first act. The game rides the setup of this opening very well and remains pretty consistent throughout, but when it reaches its final act, it takes a sharp dip in pacing and quality that makes it very hard for me to recommend this game to a wide audience. This video will probably be the one out of the series with the least amount of spoilers, but regardless, I'll still put a pinned comment in the comment section with the different timestamps for each of the sections of this video if you want to skip over certain parts. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition was released on May 29th in the year 2020. I had been anticipating this game's release since it was announced in September of last year, because I had played and enjoyed Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and I had heard that the original game was one of the best JRPGs ever made, and it was clearly the favorite among fans. With that in mind, I'm not entirely sure if my expectations were too high for this game going into it. I want to try and be as fair as possible in my analysis, but I can't ignore this disconnect between what I've seen and heard about the game and what I actually played. For the record, the only other installment in the series that I played is Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and the Torna DLC, if that counts. I didn't play the original game when it came out for the Wii in 2010, or the 3DS re-release, or the Wii U version, and I haven't played Xenoblade Chronicles X, which was on the Wii U, but from what I understand, I'm not really missing much there. I'm going to try my best not to compare this game too much to its sequel, but seeing as it's the only other Xenoblade game I've played, some comparisons and references are probably inevitable. Before all you Xenoblade purists out there get all high and mighty and say I'm not qualified enough to review this game, you should know this. I'll be the first to admit that I don't know everything about this game. There are definitely people out there who are further down this Xenoblade rabbit hole than I am. But I've spent 200 plus hours on this game over 3 separate playthroughs, so I think I have a good enough sense of what this game has to offer. Alright, now that I've explained where I'm coming from on this game, we can start talking about the details. Let's start off with something that this game gets undeniably right. The visual presentation is off the charts, especially for a game on the Switch. They really went above and beyond to give this game the visuals it deserves. There are a few things like the draw distance on grass in the open fields and some unfortunate clipping issues that are clearly leftovers from the original version, but in the face of everything else that they polished up, these issues are extremely forgivable. I do have some problems with the design of certain things in the back half of the game, but the environmental design, especially in the first half of the game, is absolutely stunning. The game has an internal clock with a day, evening, night cycle that most of the areas in the game dynamically react to in ways that are extremely visually striking. It's even exemplified on the title screen, as you've already seen. There are some areas which feature weather effects that can drastically change the look of an environment, as well as add another layer of complexity to the core gameplay. What is that core gameplay? Well, the way I see it, there are 3 to 4 different categories that you can split gameplay into depending on how you define it. They are exploring the environments, gathering collectibles, fighting, and engaging with the menu-based systems. We're going to go through each of these one by one, starting with the collectibles since they're the shortest and easiest to explain. There are collectibles strewn about all over the place, seemingly at random. Every collectible is just a floating orb chilling out in the world waiting to be picked up. There's no button press, no requirements from the player to pick them up, you just run into it and it immediately goes into your inventory. Most of them are blue, which means that they're generic collectibles that will respawn if you leave and come back, but there are also red ones that are unique and can only be picked up once. It's weird that they didn't at least map each collectible type to a different looking sprite, like a flower for nature things and a gear for scrap parts, kind of like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 does, but that might have actually made things worse considering how mismatched some of these items could be with their location. It's nice that you don't have to stop your momentum to pick up items, but there's no decision to be made, you just see a floating orb and walk over it. Every collectible has a percentage drop rate, which you might recognize from my video about Monster Hunter Generations. Unlike that game though, every single spawn location looks exactly the same, so it's not like you can go and search in a specific area if you want to get a certain type of item. You can't be sure what kind of collectible you'll be getting until after you've collected a bunch in your general area, and by that time you might think that you already have enough of whatever's there anyway. If you want to know where to get a specific item, you need to either remember where you picked it up the first time and hope you get lucky, or look up the location with the highest spawn rate and hope you get lucky. This is one of the many things that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 does better, and it's a shame that they couldn't have adapted some of its improvements into this definitive edition. Collectibles are heavily tied to the menu-based systems, which of course means that they're not actually a real part of the gameplay, and I'm only half kidding about that. There are no consumable items in this game besides the ether cylinders, and those are only used in the crafting minigame, which is in the menu. That means that there's no incentive to go pick up collectibles in order to replenish a diminishing resource. More on that when we get to talk about the crafting minigame. Collectibles are sometimes used to complete side quests. In those contexts, they arguably facilitate exploration, but more often than not, the side quests will give you a big red exclamation point on the map, which will just tell you exactly where the collectible is. If you decide to track the side quests, the exclamation point will turn blue, and there will be an actual trail of dots to follow on the minimap telling you not only exactly where the collectible is, but also exactly how to get there. If some organic form of exploration was the goal, then I'd say they'd miss the mark by a pretty wide margin, but then again, it's easy to look back from a post-Breath of the Wild perspective and say that kind of thing. What's more confusing is if exploration wasn't one of their main goals in the gameplay, which is debatable and we'll get to that, why are the maps so freaking huge? By the way, this is going to be the part of the video with the most visual spoilers, so if you want to skip straight ahead to the menu-based systems, you could just go down in the comments and hit up that timestamp, alright? Cool, let's go. There are 21 areas in this game, 6 of which are much bigger than they need to be. By that, I don't mean that there are a couple of extra locations that are underutilized or altogether useless, though that is certainly the case with some of them. I mean that there are large swaths of these areas that have next to nothing going on in them, except for running around and getting attacked by monsters. Fighting out on the open plains is a great thing, and it's something that I think sets JRPGs apart from other genres of RPG, but it stands to reason that some of the more focused combat encounters happen in the more linear dungeon-like areas. It seems like in the larger, more open areas, a sense of immense scale was prioritized above almost everything else, and that's not always a bad thing. The visual presentation alone makes the act of exploring these environments more satisfying than it probably should be given the low level of interactivity within them. As a matter of fact, it might be because there's not that much to truly interact with which allows the maps to be as large as they are. I was pretty thrown off when I realized that you could actually swim all the way to the base of the big waterfall in Magna Forest, and then I was even more thrown off when it was revealed that the map was about twice as large as I thought it was going to be. It's a testament to the game that Magna Forest is one of the smallest of the 6 areas I mentioned earlier. The sheer scale of the maps must have been insane to witness in 2010 on the Wii. And you know what? The size of the maps might have been all the incentive players needed to go exploring back then. I wouldn't know because I wasn't playing those types of games in 2010, but it certainly isn't enough incentive in today's day and age. That of course opens up the can of worms of how do you even judge this game? Do you compare it against its contemporaries, or do you compare it against the original 2010 release? If you think I'm gonna spoil something that juicy in the first video of this series, you're sorely mistaken. You'll just have to wait until we get there. Anyway, let's get back to the levels, shall we? For the sake of completeness, and because I like to categorize things, let's revisit this table I put up earlier. The easiest maps to put in a box are those in the 3 categories at the bottom. The Mechonis Core is just a boss room and should not count towards the total amount of areas in the game. Also, hilariously, Prison Island is on the list of area maps twice. I don't think they could have gotten more blatant with their desire to pad out the number of maps on this list. The settlement areas are some of my favorite areas because they make the most sense for exploration. Each of them have a central hub in the form of a small town or settlement, and they're surrounded by areas to explore. Colony 9 and the Fallen Arm exemplify this much better than Colony 6, but I still think Colony 6 deserves to be in this group because it's more similar to those two than to the city areas. Frontier Village and Alchemoth are the two most disappointing areas in the game in my opinion, with Alchemoth taking a strong first place. These areas had so much potential to be bustling places full of life and commotion, but instead they're just boxes filled with NPCs waiting to give you side quests, most of which don't even take place inside the city. I just wish that there was more to do inside these places and less traveling back and forth between them and the areas that surround them. Those 6 are the easy ones. The other 15 are a lot harder to quantifiably distinguish from each other. I've split them up into 2 categories that are mostly based on my own perception of them, and I assume that there are some out there who would disagree with my assessment. The first category are the areas that are labeled open and wide. I put areas in that category if they could be best described by those 2 adjectives. Likewise, the other category is for the areas that could best be described as linear, or that have a particularly dungeon-like layout. It should go without saying, but that doesn't mean that there are no areas in the open category that could be described as linear, and that there are no areas in the linear category that could be described as open or wide. Bionis Leg is a good example of this. If you ask most people who played the game about the exploration in Xenoblade Chronicles, I bet you they'd cite Gaur Plain as one of the areas that you can explore. They're not wrong, there are a lot of different places to go and things to see in Gaur Plain, but the area itself is mapped very linearly. In the main story missions, you're always moving from the kneecap to the waist. There's never a moment when you're given multiple objectives and you have to decide where to go next. Even so, Bionis Leg is extremely wide, and it's one of the largest, if not the largest area in the game, so I think it rightfully deserves to be placed in the open category. The Central Factory in the Mechonis is an inverse example of this. There's a part of the area that's pretty wide, and there's even a main story quest that gives you multiple objectives to complete in any order you want. It has several optional locations and a shortcut to get to an area that you may have missed if you were just trucking straight through to the end. I would still consider this area mostly dungeon-like because of the abundance of elevators and linear pathways leading to and from the wide area, but some might disagree and say it can be best described as more open than anything else. Whether you categorize them as linear or open is a matter of pragmatics because they all function more or less exactly the same. Here comes the first certified hot take of this video series. There are no maps in this game that encourage exploration. In fact, some of them actually actively discourage exploration. There's nothing about running around in the open areas that will get you anything other than more combat encounters, which is what you can get in the linear areas also. Choosing to engage in the side content is much more about the community building and world building aspects of the game rather than getting you to go out and discover new parts of the map. That may or may not have been a goal of their design, but in my opinion, that's not what they do best. Similarly, exploration may or may not have been a goal in the level design, but for me, these vast areas filled a different purpose other than simply satiating a desire to see what's around the next corner. To explain what I mean, we need to go to Colony 6 and step to the edge of a cliff. When you first come to this area, you might be a couple dozen hours into the game at most. You've seen what the Bionis looks like in action in the opening cutscene, and you've seen what it looks like now, immobile, stuck in the same position that it's been in for millennia. You've been around Colony 9, up through Tephra Cave, and out onto the Bionis' leg. All this time you've been traveling on the Bionis, but you haven't really been able to get a good look at the Bionis from where you are. There's just no good way to definitively say where you are in relation to anything else. You can get a great view of the Mechonis from the knee, and there's a secret area with a beautiful landscape of Gaur Plain, which, by the way, is 100% accurate to the game map, but you can't really get a good look up at the Bionis itself. When you get to this ledge in Colony 6, you get a good vantage point next to the entire leg of the Bionis. From there, you should instantly recognize the arches over Gaur Plain on top of the Bionis' thigh. Then, if you look down, all the way down, you can see tiny little Colony 9 way at the bottom, nestled in the heel of the Bionis. When I first saw this, I instantly connected the dots and thought to myself, oh, well, if Colony 9 is there and Gaur Plain is there, then that must mean that Tephra Cave is up through the Bionis' shin bone. That feeling that washed over me once I made that realization can only be described as Shadow of the Colossus on steroids. Every area that I would visit from here on out would be perfectly contextualized as a part of this massive titan's body. This moment was the second best thing that I experienced in the entire game, and the best thing that happened to me outside of combat. It's no wonder that the same development team that made this game also had a hand in developing Breath of the Wild. If creating that feeling was an intentional decision, then a reduced emphasis on exploration is a bit more understandable. Do I wish that the game had better exploration and more engaging areas? Of course. But if it was a choice between that and creating this awe-inspiring sense of scale, I'm glad they chose the latter. I can't think of a single other game that gave me a feeling like that besides, to a much lesser extent, Shadow of the Colossus, and maybe Breath of the Wild if Hyrule was made into a living being. Spoiler alert, that feeling didn't last, and instead of boring you to tears with a list of all the areas and all the ways they fall short of delivering on that same feeling from the cliff in Colony 6, I'll just say that the level design, like many things in this game, deteriorates as the game goes on until at the end you're left with a jumbled mess of incoherent design choices and outright dissonance between the story and gameplay. I'll be peppering in those specifics about individual areas as we go through the story though, don't you worry. There's no graceful way to segue out of that, so we're just going to move on to the menu-based systems. This part of the video isn't going to be contentious at all. Alright, whether or not you consider menu-based systems as a part of the actual gameplay is a matter of perspective. In most games, the menu is the place where you find the gameplay, audio, and video settings, as well as a place to manually save. Xenoblade has this menu, but it also has a game menu, which makes it really easy to separate the parts of the menu that can actually be considered gameplay from the other aspects of the menu. It's not unique among JRPGs in this regard. A lot of games in the genre have expansive menus with multiple systems stacked on top of each other. Before going through the merits and disadvantages of each of the systems, I'm just gonna list them all out. There are 24 of them, so hold on to your britches. I'm gonna make up for not boring you to tears with lists earlier. Here are all the things that you can do in the menu of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. Change your weapons and armor, change your appearance, modify your gear with gems, play the gem crafting minigame, change your party layout, spend SP on skill trees, spend affinity coins on skill links, reorganize your arts, upgrade your arts using AP, browse your collection of area maps, fast travel, place markers on the map, time travel, peruse your current side quests, track specific side quests, check the status of Colony 6, look at the affinity chart, get surprisingly valuable information about every single named NPC in the game, channel your inner big brother and track any named NPC in the game, look at your party's affinity charts, make 2 members of your party exchange gifts, fill out the Collectopedia, see how many heart-to-hearts you're missing, and look back on a lifetime of achievements. Whew, okay, that's it. Oh wait, no, there's still the system menu. Well, actually, as I've already stated, there's nothing here that you could really consider to be a part of the gameplay, except for maybe going into expert mode and changing the level of your characters. Curiously, outside of expert mode, the leveling system is not something you directly interact with in the menu. Leveling up happens automatically, which is really smart in my opinion considering the legion of other actions you can take and systems you can engage with in the menu. At their best, these menu-based systems serve to inform your playstyle and allow you to customize how you fight. At their worst, they're a forced contrivance that forcibly breaks any sort of immersion or momentum you may have had while playing. Let's start with changing the clock, my critique of which is intricately linked with the side quests, the area maps, and the affinity chart. I don't really have a problem with the internal game clock. As I've said before, the day and night cycle gives the environment some visual variance and adds a good layer of realism, probably the only one in the whole game. I'd go out on a limb and say that that's why all the named NPCs in the game run on schedules as well. The only reason I could see for doing something like that is to foster some type of immersion in the game's world. The biggest trap that you can fall into when you make a time travel clock like this is adding so much tedium into your game that it breaks immersion instead of creating it. In this game, not only is that the case, but it's even worse because they're adding all of that on top of what is already the arduous process of acquiring side quests. To be fair, half the problem of the clock stems from that. You get side quests by talking to NPCs, most of the time. When a side quest becomes available, a white checkmark will appear on your map regardless of where you are in relation to it. You are highly encouraged to do side quests because they're one of the only ways to get experience points outside of combat. There are so many side quests to get that at first you can be overwhelmed by the sheer number of them in the world. Most of them can be found in the settlement and city areas, which are the areas that are the most densely populated with NPCs. Because of how many there are, and because of how those areas are laid out, it makes the most sense to get as many side quests as you can at once, and then go out into the surrounding areas to complete as many of them as possible. In the Affinity chart, you can look up the named NPCs and see what times they're out in the world. If you go out of your way to look into the Affinity chart, you'll realize that early on, but I personally didn't even know that that was a thing that you can do until several hours into the game. In fact, there were a lot of things about this game that I didn't realize were there until well after the point where they would have first become useful. One of those things was that you need to talk to certain named NPCs before they'll give you whatever quests they have for you. That means in addition to going to every quest marker after you change the clock, you should also go talk to all of the named NPCs, which are indicated by green dots on your minimap. They're not indicated anywhere on your regular map, which infuriates me to no end, but whatever. Once you've talked to enough named NPCs, you'll start to realize that their schedules almost always fall on hours that are divisible by 3. Most of them are out for either 9 or 12 hours out of the day, and most of them are active at either 9 AM or 9 PM. Even after I found that out, which was well after my first playthrough by the way, I still found it extremely tedious to scour the city and settlement areas for side quests. I have more to say about side quests and their role in this game, but all I'll say for now is that there are way too many of them, and very few of them are worth the time and energy going in and out of the menu to change the clock. Thankfully, none of the other systems actively hurt the experience the way that searching for side quests does. Most of them are pretty inconsequential, so let's quickly go through those. I didn't really touch the Collectopedia or the achievements list for the same reason that I stopped playing Animal Crossing after I saw the credits roll for the first time, although there is something a bit insulting about comparing how you collect items in Animal Crossing to how you get them in Xenoblade. I didn't go out of my way to do anything for Colony 6 on my first playthrough either, and I only upgraded it with the things that I had happened to come across in my travels, which left it pretty barren even in the late game. I think the Collectopedia and the Colony 6 stuff both suffer because it's not engaging enough to collect things in the world, but what else is new? The crafting minigame. Ugh, do I have to talk about the crafting minigame? Can I just not? Look, the crafting minigame is the only thing in the game that uses up resources, but it's completely optional since if you engage even just a little bit with the side content, you'll get more gems than you could possibly know what to do with. The addition of this consumable resource is the reason why there's an inventory limitation, which has got to be, hands down, the most head-ass inventory limitation I've ever seen in a video game. Look at how many gems you can carry before you run out of space. This is an unreasonable amount of gems to be able to carry before you run out of space. Affinity is basically the level to which members of your party like or dislike each other. Most of the heart-to-heart interactions are gated off until the involved party members have a high enough level of affinity with each other, and Affinity has some combat ramifications as well, but we'll get to those. Party members gain affinity with each other when they fight together, do side quests together, gift each other collectibles, or go through heart-to-hearts together. You can also lose affinity with characters if you give them a gift that they don't like, or if you pick the wrong dialogue option in a heart-to-heart. Affinity is one of the rare few things encouraging you to mix up the members of your party and play with different characters as the game goes on. If you want to stick with a single party throughout the whole game, but still want to unlock most of the heart-to-hearts, you're pretty much shit out of luck unless you want to grind for affinity with the collectibles, which is a chore to put it mildly. To go from level 2 affinity to level 3 affinity, you need to give the equivalent of 131 hearts worth of items. To go from level 3 to level 4, you need to gift 161 hearts. Part of the problem is that you won't know whether or not someone will like a gift until you give it to them, which means that you inevitably will give them just as many things that they don't like as they do while you go down the list and uncover each one. This problem is mitigated a little bit by the interface, which is one of the fastest in the game, but I think that's a poor consolation prize. I was just glad that I could get it over with faster. I rarely even used the collectibles for that purpose because I was afraid that I would need some of them for Colony 6's restoration or for a side quest later on down the road. The game has a brilliant solution to this when Shulk can see the future and tell when something will become useful to you later, which is a great use of a story element to impact gameplay outside of combat. Even so, call me paranoid, but I still never quite trusted it to activate 100% of the time when something would become useful later. There's just nothing that's all that engaging about this system, and it's a shame because the lack of affinity is the reason why I didn't see a lot of heart-to-hearts on my first playthrough. And I really wish I had because they add some much needed depth to the side characters as well as flesh out the world in which these characters live. We're almost done going through them all, don't worry, there's just a few more things we need to talk about before we can move on. Skill trees, skill links, equipment, and gems are all things that should be much more important than they are. I filled out the skill trees for my characters just because it looked pretty, and the skill links seem just as pointless. There's not a single perk here that's really worth the time to talk about, so let's move on. At the beginning of the game, gear seems kinda important, but you should quickly realize that the amount of damage that's mitigated by equipping the strongest armor you own isn't worth stopping every time you get a piece that's slightly stronger. The same goes for any new weapon you might come across as you play. Going into the menu and equipping it is just too much of a hassle. They mostly serve as a way to artificially make the game easier for yourself instead of adding anything meaningful to the combat system. The one exception in this game is when you can buy weapons for your party that can damage Mechon without the help of the Monado. There's something dubious about the gear in this game, which I discovered while I was trying to figure out how the game calculates damage. The stats of your gear increase and decrease alongside the level of your character, which has its own separate increases and decreases in stats. I feel kinda bad because the only thing I got from the attempt was that knowledge and a stress migraine, but thankfully I don't think that many people who played this game actually know or care how the game calculates damage. While I'm on this little tangent, I'd just like to point out that this extends to experience points as well, and it's much easier to illustrate what I'm talking about if I use them as an example. Even with the ability to manipulate your level at will, it is still next to impossible to figure out what goes into calculating how much experience points you'll get out of a battle because there are so many other variables that go into it. Take these two Crabbles for example. They're exactly the same type in exactly the same place, but one is level 3 and the other is level 4. If you fight the level 3 Crabble with level 3 characters, you will get 19 experience points. If you fight the level 4 Crabble with the level 3 characters, then you get 22 experience points. That makes sense, right? If an enemy is higher in level than you are, then you should get a better reward for defeating them since they should theoretically be stronger than you. Well, actually, it doesn't matter either way because if you fight the level 4 Crabble with level 4 characters, then you also get 22 experience points. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Tom, calm down, alright? It must be because if an enemy starts out at a higher level, then that must mean that they have a higher base number of experience points that you can get from them. But no, that's not the fucking case at all, because if you overlevel yourself to 6 levels above them or higher, then they'll both yield the same amount of experience points. If the level 4 Crabble has a higher base number of experience points than the other one, then that should show no matter what the discrepancy is between its level and the level of your characters. See, even though I just proved you wrong with facts and logic, there are still some enemies in the game that will give you more experience points than their underleveled counterparts even if you more than outlevel them both. Now imagine trying to figure out all of that, but the amount of experience points gained could randomly fall within a range of values spanning from wide to gaping, and you'll understand why I gave up on the whole damage thing. I understand and appreciate the amount of work and equations it took to make all of the numbers in this game work somewhat effectively in the way that they do, but I don't think that it results in a very cohesive difficulty curve, which I'll get more into in the combat section. Long story short, I just think that they muddied the waters way too much when it comes to the numbers in this game, which makes it hard to care about generic ass stats like physical defense and agility and strength. Anyway, rant over. The important part is that none of the gear have tangible effects on the combat system outside of the anti-mechon weapons. It feels like they're mostly there for cosmetic reasons, and I'm not just talking about the outfits. The most useful pieces of equipment are the gems because most of them play into status effects, which are the heart and soul of what makes the combat in this game so compelling. The last part of the menu that I want to bring up is the part of the menu where you upgrade and manage your arts. This is my personal favorite part of the menu because it's the one that has the most tangible effect on the gameplay outside of the menu. Jesus Christ, how many times can I say menu in 12 seconds? Upgrading your arts is pretty standard. Each art has multiple levels of upgrades, and you need to decide how to allocate your resources depending on which arts you like to use and which upgrades are available to you. And what is their only important use, you can visit shops to buy skill books in order to upgrade your arts further. By the end of the game, that's the only reason I would be visiting shops. The ability to reorganize where your arts are placed on the palette is a nice touch and a great way to customize how you interact with the combat system. So that's it. That's most of the menu-based systems in the game. There are a few that I haven't mentioned either because they're so inconsequential that they're not worth bringing up, or I'll be bringing them up in future videos. I started a run where I tried to not interact with the game menu at all. I don't think I'll finish that run through, but I appreciate that it's even possible to play the game that way. Since leveling up gives you such a large increase in power, getting experience points to level up is debatably the only thing you need to do in order to progress through the game. I think you'd be insane if you didn't upgrade your arts as well, but everything else besides those two systems are completely optional. I'll bring up that run again in the combat section, but in terms of the menu-based systems, I have to say I didn't really miss them. It felt kinda nice to give a big middle finger to all those times that I was fretting over the decisions that ultimately didn't matter. In conclusion, most of the menu-based systems in this game feel superfluous. They were added because having gear with high stat numbers attached to your character looks impressive, and playing around with numbers in the menu is a nice distraction from what is a first draft of a combat system. If you think that sounds harsh, that's because it is. Despite even its most glaring flaws, I still really like this combat system. Half the reason I love JRPGs in the first place is because of how unique their combat systems can be, and Xenoblade Chronicles is no exception. I have a lot of problems with the combat system, but it does its job so well that most of them could be considered nitpicks, especially when you look at it as the first attempt at a combat system, which the studio would refine and improve on with their future installments. If you've seen my previous video about JRPGs, you should know that Xenoblade Chronicles falls on the real-time combat side of the genre. As a recap, this means that each active combatant is free to perform any action they have at any time within the constraints of their own moveset, regardless of whether or not any other combatant is acting. Just like a wedding cake and or lugas, there are multiple layers to this combat system, so let's start at the ground floor. The first thing that happens when you initiate a battle is a quick time button prompt. Successfully completing the prompt will raise the tension level of your party, which I'm pretty sure raises the accuracy and movement speed of your party members. I say I'm pretty sure because there isn't a single line of dialogue or written out tutorial that explains what tension is. It's clear that having more of it is good and losing it is bad, but it's not clear what it tangibly does for you. One of Melia's skills prevents a loss of accuracy when the tension goes down, which means that accuracy is definitely affected by tension confirmed, but that doesn't mean that that's the only thing affected. Accuracy is also heavily linked to the difference in level between you and your enemy, so I'm not sure to what extent tension plays a role in that equation. Movement speed is hard to reliably test outside of a gut feeling, so I'm really not entirely sure what it does. If anyone knows for sure what it does, please enlighten me in the comments. At the very least, it makes it harder for your party members to get discouraged, which causes the music to change and makes their sprites in the heads-up display make a sad face. Anyway, after you initiate combat, you will begin to periodically auto-attack an enemy if you're within range of that enemy. Auto-attacking happens at a steady rate that is completely out of your control, but you can move around and auto-attack at the same time. If you've played Xenoblade Chronicles 2, then you'll understand why I nearly jumped out of my seat when I saw that you could do this. The main characters from both games have arts that if used on the sides or back of an enemy, can trigger a critical hit that drastically increases the damage given. Being able to position yourself while attacking makes landing those critical hits miles easier. The ability to move and auto-attack at the same time is what makes this combat system so smooth and fluid. You never have to pause for anything outside of the cooldowns on your arts. Speaking of which, at the bottom of the screen is the palette for your arts. Each character can have 8 regular arts equipped plus 1 talent art that's special and gets placed in the middle. Every regular art in this game is unique to a certain character, but they all fall into one of 6 categories: physical, break, topple, daze, support, and elemental. These are my own classifications for the arts. The way the game breaks them up into separate colored groups is kinda messy. The arts for break, topple, and daze are all correctly mapped to pink, green, and gold respectively, but the physical, support, and elemental arts are all mixed up between red, light blue, yellow, and purple. The physical arts are mostly mapped correctly except for a few outliers here and there, but the other two are much more mixed. I lumped in anything that heals or puts a buff on one or more party members into the category of support, as well as anything that places a debuff other than break, topple, or daze on an enemy. That does cast a pretty wide net, but all of these arts share the same quality of being better left to the AI members of your party. Support encompasses all of the yellow and purple arts, again except for a couple that belong in physical, and most of the light blue arts. The elemental arts are all light blue and are all unique to Melia. I didn't want to lump them into the support category because they are all basically extensions of her talent art. The talent art is the thing that most closely defines how a certain character is meant to be played. Once Shulk gets the Monado, he can activate it, opening up a whole new palette of Monado arts for him to choose from. Ryan's talent art draws aggro from an enemy, solidifying his role as a tank. Sharla is forced to use her talent art if she uses too many arts in a row and her rifle overheats. Dunban's talent art is an all-out assault comprising of multiple quick-time events for the potential for massive damage. Phil Swift style, Melia shoots the enemy with whatever element she has summoned for a variety of effects and damage, and Ricky has the least inspired talent art that just lets him steal an item from an enemy. Talent arts don't have set cooldown timers like the rest of the arts do. You need to use auto attacks to fill up the talent gauge in order to use talent arts repeatedly. This is another area where being able to move and auto attack comes in handy because you don't have to plant your feet into the ground if you want to fill up the talent gauge. You can keep positioning yourself in the meantime. Even with all the unique arts and playstyles on offer, I don't think the combat system rewards experimenting with multiple party layouts enough. My complaint here mostly stems from the roles that party members play in combat. There are 3 main roles that a character can fill: attack, tank, and healer. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 makes this very apparent, and I'm not sure if this is one of those things where, because I played the sequel first, I had certain preconceptions about this game going into it, especially since this game never explicitly states that those are the roles that each character can fill. The descriptions of attack and tank roles still fit in this game, but support seems a much more apt description for the third role other than healer. I don't think it's a stretch to say that most players will gravitate towards playing as Shulk for a majority of the game since he is the main protagonist and you're forced to have him in your party for at least half of the game, if not more. Shulk defines the role of attacker in this game. You're meant to be dealing a lot of damage to the enemy, but you're not meant to be the target of that enemy. If an enemy is targeting you, then they will always be facing you. No matter how much you run around them or try to outmaneuver them, you will never be able to land those sweet spot critical hits that make playing as Shulk so satisfying. That's why it's so important to have a tank on the team. Tanks usually have large health pools and arts that draw aggro from enemies so that they can be a damage sponge while the attacker goes to work. Dunban and Ryan are the only 2 dedicated tanks in this game, which is a good number of tanks to have. In a group of 6 with 3 roles to be filled, there should be 2 of each role. While I personally didn't find it that engaging to play as these 2 characters, I can't deny that they fill their combat roles admirably. The same goes for Sharla. She is the only dedicated healer in the game and a necessary member of the party if you're going up against an enemy that's at or above your current level. She has 2 main healing arts, one that targets a single party member and one that heals the whole party, as well as a host of other arts that boost defense or remove debuffs from the party. As with Dunban and Rhine, controlling Charla directly leaves a little something to be desired, but she's by far the most effective support character in your party. That leaves Ricky and Melia, both of which feel like characters who are torn between multiple roles and don't fill a single one effectively. Melia is torn right down the middle between support and attack, and Ricky feels like an amalgamation of all three roles with a half-baked talent art thrown in at the last minute. I was gonna do this when we introduced him in the story, but we might as well address it now. Ricky is not a tank. I get that he has one of the highest health pools in the game, but he doesn't have a single art that draws aggro. In gameplay, he more feels like Shulk with multiple arts that have sweet spot attacks from the side and back. He also has an abundance of support arts though, so that makes it kind of hard to put him in one of these boxes. I never really understood how to play Melia. I just kind of spammed her elemental arts until her talent gauge filled up, and then every now and then I would go in for the Spear Break Starlight Kick combo. I know I'm jumping around a bit here and there's a lot of information to take in, but I want to back up a bit and talk about why Break, Topple, and Daze each have their own category of arts. These are the most useful debuffs in the game, and they stack on top of each other. If you inflict Break on an enemy, they become more susceptible to Topple, and if an enemy is toppled, then they are more susceptible to Daze. Break does nothing besides making the enemy vulnerable to Topple. This is fine in my opinion considering how easy Break is to inflict and how strong Topple is. If an enemy is toppled, their evasion drops to 0, they cannot move, and any critical damage taken is increased, and it opens up the enemy to Daze. Topple is the most useful debuff in the game not only for all the reasons I've stated above, but also because it prevents the toppled enemy from completing whatever art they had queued up. This will be a big deal when we talk about Shulk's clairvoyant tendencies in battle. When an enemy is dazed, its critical damage taken is increased again, its aggro does not increase, and all active auras are removed. Of these three things, the further increase in critical damage taken is the only really important one. The aggro of enemies very often does not matter because most of the time you can direct your party members to attack whichever enemy you're attacking. The game may say that Daze removes an enemy's auras, but I don't believe them. I think it's just inconsistent because I've never seen this happen, but who knows, maybe I'll be able to find some footage of it and put it up now so that everybody can laugh at how stupid I am. Daze is introduced at the same time as Break and Topple, but players likely won't have access to arts that inflict Daze until they're already several hours deep. That might seem like a problem to some people, but I think the pacing of it is actually a good thing considering it gives players an opportunity to get used to inflicting Break and Topple consistently before adding that final layer on top. This sequence of inflicting Break, then Topple, then Daze is the thing that you'll be fishing for in the majority of combat situations in the game, and it borders right on the line of becoming too repetitive for its own good. This is one of the big, glaring problems of this combat system, that instead of expanding upon the moveset that's already there, too often pieces are simply taken away like the devs were playing Jenga with the moveset. Now would be as good a time as any to go back to my menuless run. In addition to not engaging with any of the menu-based systems, I'm also going through the game without using any armor. Technically, taking off the armor counts as engaging with the menu, but I'm okay with that concession. I'm going to make some conjecture about the game based on this run, but I know it's a bit flawed because I've only made it to Aerith Sea so far, which is about halfway through the game if you don't know. Even so, I can safely say that there are more than enough enemies, appropriately leveled enemies, in each area of the game that you can artificially superpower yourself by over-leveling your characters. This is a pretty good way to have the players set their own difficulty for themselves, but it falls short in a lot of other ways. There's not much in the way of introducing a gameplay mechanic and then testing the player on it, or adding a new element that expands on that concept. There are exceptions like the Break Topple Daze thing we just talked about, but they all happen in the first half of the game and are completely absent in the second half. So, what's the developer's approach to balancing difficulty as the game goes on? I don't fucking know, just put a bunch of enemies everywhere and take away some of their options, that ought to slow them down. This gets extremely apparent in the second half of the game, and I'll expand more when we get there, but suffice to say that there are way too many enemies that are outright immune to either Break or Topple. An example of a good expansion on this system already exists in this game, and that's when certain enemies are resistant to Break arts. which means you either need to fight them on their own terms or activate a chain attack to bypass that resistance. This brings up the final layer of the combat cake, and that is the party gauge. In addition to gauging how lit a party is, this glowing meter has two functions. You can use one of the 3 sections of the gauge to revive a fallen party member, or you can use all 3 sections at once to activate a chain attack. This stops the battle in its tracks and brings everybody's arts off of cooldown temporarily. Each party member then takes turns as you select an art from each one to use in succession on whatever enemy the party leader had targeted at the beginning of the chain attack. You're guaranteed that each party member will at least get one shot in, but there are a couple of ways that you can extend the chain attack through what's called a chain link. One is to repeatedly use arts of the same color. Another is to initiate or extend the break, topple, daze combo. Neither of these guarantee a chain link, but if you raise your party members' affinity levels enough, then the chances of you getting those extra attacks in greatly increases. See, I told you affinity was going to come back around. Inflicting debuffs like break, topple, and daze are much more possible during a chain attack, except of course for the 1/3 of enemies in the back half of the game that are just outright immune to one of them. Alright, so everything that I've just explained are the main aspects of the combat system that are under the player's control. There are some other aspects of the combat system, mainly auras and the vision mechanic, but those are things that the player has to react to, and if you'll indulge me, I'd like to discuss those more in conjunction with the story. So if that's what the combat looks like on the player's end, what do the enemies look like? Well, enemy variety is kind of weird in this game. There's a wide range of enemies spanning from small spiders to literal dragons, but outside of their appearance, they all act pretty much the same way. They all have the same tools you do. They periodically auto-attack, and occasionally they'll use some arts. They have access to topple and daze, but I've never seen an enemy use break. Perhaps they do, and they just don't show you that. There are some groups of enemies that can even pull chain attacks on you, but that is extremely rare. I've only seen it happen twice, and there's only one group that I could consistently get chain attacked by. The biggest difference in enemy types are between the generic monsters and the unique monsters. Unique monsters are pretty much just larger versions of their generic counterparts that have larger health bars and higher damage outputs, nothing to write home about. There are a couple of unique monsters that roam around some of the starting areas, which are leveled way above what you're expected to be at that point in the game. You're trusted to avoid them, but if you try to fight them, you'll realize that none of your auto attacks will land. And unless you have endgame gear and skills, none of your arts will land either. This was the first big red flag I got from the combat system. If anything is 6 levels above you or higher, you are arbitrarily locked away from landing an auto attack on them. I think what happens is if that certain disparity between the levels is there, they place a massive evasion multiplier on the enemy. No matter how hard you try, no matter how good your stats and gear are, you won't be able to land a single hit. What this means is that there's no incentive to truly master the combat system in this game, though I'll admit that's a pretty niche problem. The bigger issue is that they didn't have to do this. The attacks that these higher leveled enemies have already deal more than enough damage to discourage players from taking them on early. The only thing that they accomplished by adding this in was lowering the skill ceiling. By the way, this goes both ways. If an enemy is 6 levels below you or lower, they will not be able to touch you. This problem is brought to the forefront on New Game Plus, where all of the stakes and tension in the scripted sequences are just completely eradicated. These arbitrary evasion multipliers placed on level discrepancies are completely harebrained, and I have no idea why they did this. It just sucks. That also ties into my argument for why I think exploration is sometimes discouraged in this game. In most of the open areas, there are large swaths of the map that are covered in enemies which are leveled much higher than what you would feasibly be able to take on the first time that you get there. These enemies read as post-game content because most of them are leveled higher than any of the enemies in the final dungeon, and some of them are even higher in level than the final boss of the whole game. If they're supposed to be post-game content, why are they always here, even at the beginning of the game? Well, I think one reason is to make the player cautious. The open areas are often played up as hostile worlds that should not be traversed lightly. These higher-leveled enemies give some credence to that feeling and teach the player to always be aware of their surroundings. You never know when a higher-leveled enemy could sneak up behind you and take you by surprise. Another reason to add enemies like this is to discourage exploration, or that might just be an unintended side effect. You know what, I think I'm just gonna stop beating this dead horse. For the amount of times that I've brought it up so far, I should make it clear that this is a nitpick rather than an actual problem with the game. You could go through the whole game discovering every nook and cranny of every single map, or you could just truck straight through to the end and it would have a minimal difference on your experience with the game. If you explored a lot more, you might be more impressed with the sheer amount of playable space there is in this game, but that's about it. Whether or not you think that's a good or bad thing is up to you. Hopefully I've made it clear where I stand on the topic. Thankfully this game has a lot going for it outside of that. As you may have picked up on, the combat system is extremely complex and the narrative to this game is about as convoluted as you could ask for from a JRPG. That's what we'll be focusing on next time. We'll be looking at the first half of the game, including the story elements and some more specific comments on the gameplay and level design. Hope to see you then. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. I know this video is really long already, but I feel like I'd be doing myself a disservice if I didn't plug myself a little bit, so let's see if we can get 6 likes on this video. No, but seriously though, if you want to support my channel, the easiest thing to do is just hit the subscribe button. If you want to hit the bell too, that's fine. With the rate that I'm coming out with these videos, at least I'm not going to be flooding your sub box with a bunch of useless bullshit. If you'd like to take your support a step further, you can hit up the link to my Patreon in the description. I'm still very new at this, and I know it's going to take a while for me to get things off the ground, but I'm really trying every single day here, guys, and you know, you won't really get anywhere unless you take first step, so that's that. Again, thanks so much for watching. It really means a lot to me, and the next video should be up in about a month, so I hope we'll see you then. Bye.